twilight of an autumn day, Osamu Dazai sat in a small roadside cafe. The road captured Yokohama's sunset in all its splendor. On the table, there was a cold coffee for himself and a hot one for a woman who had been waiting in the cafe for hours. The cafe staff pitied Dazai, thinking he was waiting in vain. Just as one of the waitstaff was about to approach Dazai to offer some sympathy, a peculiar woman arrived and took a seat across from him. She had raven black hair, even darker eyes, a pale face, and a slim figure. Wearing a dark crimson coat with a white vest that contrasted elegantly with her coat, she immediately took a sip from the coffee that had been set for her. Then she called over the waiter and ordered a lemon cake. Dazai looked at the woman sitting across from him, Yoshiko Shina, a woman with a calm face, but a cold, emotionless gaze, slowly held her coffee cup. At first glance, they seemed like two strangers, but the truth was something else entirely. After a brief pause, Dazai gave a faint smile and said, "So, you finally decided to come out of your hiding hole? I didn't think you'd trust me." In a cold, sharp tone, Shina replied, "I'm surprised I'm even here myself." She gave a cold smile and stared into Dazai's eyes. She knew well that their last encounter had escalated into an endless battle, a game of chess where every move inflicted a deep wound on the other. Shina was not only a serial killer, she had a complex and ruthless mind masked by calm and silence. Dazai leaned forward slightly and, with a soft but piercing voice, continued, "So, what have you been up to these days?" Shina took another sip of her coffee, lost in thought. The sip was the only sound in the quiet cafe. Her gaze toward Dazai made it clear the game wasn't over. The only difference was that this time, the game had shifted from the tense streets of Yokohama to a peaceful cafe. After a few moments, Shina looked at him cautiously and in a soft voice said, "You know better than I do what I've been up to lately." Dazai smiled, but something cold and lifeless flickered in his gaze. He knew this meeting couldn't be simple or without purpose. He had come to ask Shina for a specific favor, but he was also aware that playing mind games with her always carried its own risks. Without further preamble, Dazai leaned toward Shina and said in a serious, direct tone, "I'm guessing more preamble would really ruin your mood." Shina, in a calm and ironic tone, replied, "If you knew that, why did you drag it out?" A bit of surprise crossed Dazai's face before he offered a foolish grin that suited his usual demeanor and presented his request to Shina. Without the slightest change in her expression, Shina placed her empty coffee cup slowly on the table and stared into Dazai's eyes. A cold silence spread between them, a moment more like a freeze than an ordinary conversation. After a heavy pause, Shina slowly stood up, adjusted her dark red coat, and, without a hint of interest or even acknowledgement, stepped toward the cafe door. Dazai didn't move and simply watched her. His smile laced with a hint of regret as he said, "I'll be right here, waiting." As Shina approached the exit, she paused for a moment, but didn't look back. In a calm, emotionless voice, almost like a whisper, she said, "Dazai, you know better than anyone that I don't want to get involved in these foolish gifted games anymore." Without another moment's hesitation, she continued walking and left the cafe, like a ghost, vanishing into the night. Dazai remained seated, wondering if he had truly overstepped with his request. But he knew this was important, and Yoshiko Shina wasn't someone he could easily draw into his schemes. one thing became abundantly clear to Dazai. Shina was no longer the person he had met years ago. As Dazai finally took a sip of his coffee, he recalled his first encounter with Shina, a memory that likely held no pleasant recollection for her. It was a moonlit night in a rural home far from the city. Yoshiko was there with her father, mother, older brother, and younger sister. She and her sister were pleading with their brother to play with them, but he was immersed in his schoolwork and ignored their pleas. Meanwhile, Yoshiko's parents were outside in the yard, chatting and sipping tea. Even though it was past 11 and the children usually went to bed by 10, their parents had let them stay up and play because their great-uncle was supposed to visit them from the city that night. Eventually, the children grew tired of asking their brother and started playing hide-and-seek inside. Suddenly, a loud sound interrupted their game, a gunshot. Yet even more terrifying than the gunfire was their mother's scream, which was abruptly cut off by another shot. Immediately following the gunfire and their mother's scream, a heavy and ominous silence filled the house. Yoshiko and her younger sister trembled in fear, their eyes fixed on their brother, who had dropped his books for the first time. His face a mixture of terror and rage as he rushed toward the door. In a calm but firm voice, he said to Yoshiko, "You two stay here and don't come out, no matter what happens. I'll go see what's going on." But Yoshiko's fear and anxiety were too great for her to simply wait. When her brother headed for the yard, she took her little sister's hand in silence and crept toward the window facing the yard to see what was happening outside. The faint moonlight illuminated the yard, casting shadows everywhere. Through these shadows, Yoshiko saw unfamiliar men, dressed in dark clothes, standing outside. They held guns and wore masks that hid their faces. Her parents lay motionless on the ground, and in the distance, a shadowy figure with a gun approached her older brother. Her brother bravely stepped toward the intruders, but Yoshiko cast another glance at him. A boy who had just set his school books down, still very much a child. Her heart clenched, yet she held tightly to her younger sister, watching in that deadly silence. A moment later, the sound of another gunshot echoed through the yard, this time aimed at her brother. Yoshiko couldn't say a word. Her mouth was open in silent horror, breath caught in her throat. The footsteps of the attackers moved closer from the yard toward the house, and in that moment, she realized she had to save her sister. With trembling hands, she guided her little sister to a small cupboard in the corner of the room. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks as she whispered, "Stay here and don't make a sound. I won't let anything happen to you." As Yoshiko closed the cupboard door, she looked at her little sister one last time, a look that would be forever etched in her memory. She walked unsteadily to the kitchen and grabbed a sharp, gleaming knife. Her small fingers gripped it tightly, though her hands shook with fear and anger. She was ready to face the intruders, with everything left in her to protect her sister. But suddenly, a terrifying scream from her younger sister filled the room where she'd hidden her. The sound sliced through her heart like a blade, and without thinking, she ran back toward the room. She hadn't even reached it when another gunshot rang out. As she stumbled into the room, her breath ragged and terrified, she saw her sister lying motionless and covered in blood. The men standing in the room, with cold and unfeeling expressions, stared down at her sister's lifeless body. Seeing this, Yoshiko felt an overwhelming surge of pressure and sorrow, an agony she could no longer contain. A darkness, a wave of vengeance and pain erupted within her, and an unknown power awakened inside. The force was so intense, it caused her black hair to turn stark white. Moments later, the room's space transformed for the dark-clad men. Black flowers emerged from the ground, and an expansive field of black blossoms appeared before her. The men who had just ruthlessly murdered her family were now trapped within this field, facing their own horrific and unbearable nightmares. Yoshiko, her eyes void of emotion, watched them in silence, observing their struggles and terror. One by one, as they flailed helplessly, each attacker fell to the ground among the black flowers, faces twisted in horror and despair. Yoshiko, with the kitchen knife clutched in her small hands, took down each one, the petals around them absorbing the weight of vengeance, until the room lay in utter silence. When the last of the intruders had fallen, Yoshiko stood alone amidst the black field, her gaze fixed on her little sister's lifeless body. In that moment, her innocent world shattered forever. She was now left utterly alone, burdened with a sorrow that she could never escape. All night, Yoshiko was consumed by grief and nightmares, haunting visions of her sister, angry, questioning why she hadn't saved her, why her powers had only awakened after it was too late. These nightmares and thoughts tortured her, holding her in a relentless grip of guilt and self-blame. The neighbors, alerted by the gunshots, had rushed to the house, discovering the lifeless bodies of the masked men, who seemed to have died of strokes, alongside Yoshiko's family, who had been brutally gunned down. They found Yoshiko curled up in a corner, weeping and murmuring pleas for forgiveness, clutching herself tightly as if to keep from breaking. When the police arrived and took over the investigation, the neighbors returned to their homes, shaken. The officers decided to send Yoshiko to an asylum to help her recover enough to speak about what had happened. During those bleak and sorrowful days, Yoshiko Shina was confined to a cold, spiritless asylum. The empty walls and desolate shadows there only reminded her of that horrifying night. She was drowning in the nightmares and sorrow that clung to her like a dark, consuming spectre. Her sister's voice and the vision of her accusing stare played on a loop in her mind, each day amplifying her self-hatred. The doctors and nurses struggled to soothe her. She didn't speak, and besides the occasional incoherent murmurs, she barely acknowledged anyone. All they knew was that she was a shattered, lonely girl devastated by the loss of her family. But none of them could grasp the depth of the rage and sorrow corroding her soul. One night, when everything was quiet, Yoshiko once again envisioned that black field, the very field that had swallowed the ruthless men with masks. She thought of the strange and fearsome power that had awakened within her that night. She realized this terrifying gift had enabled her to exact her revenge, but the cost of wielding it had been enormous. Shina understood that each time she used the black field, a part of her spirit, her very sanity, was the price she had to pay. Over time, Yoshiko gradually gained control over her mysterious ability, yet something fundamental within her had changed. She was no longer the innocent young girl she once was. A coldness and ruthlessness had taken over her face, replacing the soft expressions of her childhood. She had become a woman who pledged no loyalty to anyone and depended on no one. 2 months had passed since her family's brutal murder, and in that time, the childlike sparkle in her eyes had faded. Her black hair had grown back, while nurses had cut off the white strands to help her forget the horrifying memory associated with them. In just 2 months, Yoshiko Shina had transformed into someone entirely different, a person whose eyes held nothing but rage. The 14-year-old girl now looked as though she were 30. During her time in the asylum, she had grown thin, and her skin had become deathly pale. If not for her dark eyes, she could easily be mistaken for a vampire. Once Yoshiko fully mastered her ability, the Black Flowers, she escaped from the asylum and disappeared into Yokohama's dark underworld. She concealed her power and eventually managed to connect with a member of Port Mafia, through whom she found her way into the organization. 2 years later, at 16, she met Dazai Osamu during an operation, a young man known as the youngest leader in Mafia history. In their first conversation, they seemed like prodigies of the Mafia's dark world, one a young leader and the other an assassin. Their dialogue was straightforward, focused solely on the operation they were working on. Yet, even so, Dazai sensed something hidden within Shina. Her soulless eyes had only one purpose: revenge. But who was the target of this vengeance? For Dazai, this was a fascinating mystery to solve. Dazai asked his friend Sakaguchi to investigate Shina, and the results made him curious about recruiting her. He approached Port Mafia's boss, Mori Ugai, about the idea, and Mori's cryptic response only piqued Dazai's interest further. However, he decided to set his curiosity aside and return to his daily routine. 2 weeks passed since that meeting, and Port Mafia members were dying mysteriously, one by one, of sudden strokes. Knowing who was responsible, Dazai asked his colleague, Nakahara Chuya, to help him capture the culprit. Chuya, enraged by the deaths of his subordinates, agreed. 2 nights later, Yoshiko Shina was chained in the Mafia's basement, and her interrogator was Dazai Osamu. Dazai sat opposite Shina, who was chained to the wall, looking at her with a curious expression. With a detached tone, he asked, "Why did you waste 2 years before making your move? You could have started killing right after escaping the asylum." Shina, her body covered in wounds and barely conscious, replied, "Did you really think everyone has a talent for murder from childhood? Like you?" Dazai, certain this wasn't the real answer, repeated his question. This time, Shina let out a laugh and said, "I thought you already knew. After all, Yoshiko Shina is just a useful pawn, as long as she doesn't go feral." Realizing Shina had overheard his conversation with Mori, Dazai asked with curiosity, "How? Were you there?" With a proud look, Yoshiko replied, "My ability isn't just for killing." Understanding the deep-seated hatred Shina held for the Mafia, Dazai paused momentarily, then asked with his usual keen gaze, "So this revenge, it's for your family, the family that the Mafia took from you." With soulless eyes filled with suppressed anger, Shina looked directly at Dazai and said, "You think this is just revenge? It's only the beginning of a path. The Mafia took everything from me. My life, my dreams, even my smallest comforts." Dazai looked at her and let out a cold chuckle. "We all have something to lose, Shina. Maybe you think you're the only one the Mafia took everything from, but even so, it doesn't justify killing every single member." Yoshiko responded with determination. "It does for me. They destroyed something sacred to me. Now it's my turn to erase their lives with the same bitterness." Dazai nodded in agreement, then spoke in a mysterious tone. "But here you are now, chained and at the mercy of those you once despised. What's on your mind? Were you planning to surrender this easily? Or maybe You're just waiting for another chance to take revenge. Shina gave a cold smile, her eyes gleaming with a hint of scheme and deceit. Surrender? If you think this is the end, then you don't know me at all, Dazai Osamu. She tilted her head slightly and added, a person who has lost everything has nothing left to fear. Chuya, who had been standing in a corner, silently observing the interrogation, stepped forward and said firmly, all this philosophy is pointless. If you don't have a solid reason for this massacre, there'll be nothing left for you except being buried alive. Shina's smile deepened, and she glanced at Chuya. You think I'm making excuses? This is just the beginning. You think these chains can hold me, but once my revenge is complete, nothing will stand in my way. Dazai paused, lost in thought for a moment, then motioned for Chuya to leave the room. Once the door closed, Chuya asked, You think she could be trouble? Dazai looked at the closed door, a slightly pensive expression on his face, and replied, Those fresh wounds, and that look in her eyes. Something inside her is still awake. Maybe she's more dangerous than we think. Chuya glanced at Dazai with a scowl and said, If she's so dangerous, why is she still alive? For someone who kills mafia members without hesitation, is there any reason to keep her breathing? Dazai nodded slowly and said, Perhaps, but there's something about Shina that I need to understand. Not just because of her murders, but because of why she hid herself behind the mask of a simple assassin for 2 years. Maybe she has something that could be useful for Port Mafia. Or maybe... Dazai paused, then added, I need to find out exactly what she's hiding. Chuya gave a bitter smile and said with a hint of sarcasm, Well, that curiosity of yours is going to get you into trouble soon, Dazai. Be careful. This girl, whatever she may be, might be like a deadly queen on the chessboard. That night, Dazai decided that the only way to uncover the truth was to get closer to Shina and observe her reactions under different circumstances. Using the excuse that Shina might still have more information to reveal, he arranged for her to be kept as a prisoner in a secure cell, monitored closely but still in Port Mafia's custody. Shina, who appeared calm on the surface, stared at the ceiling of her cell, her mind burning with the fire of revenge. The moments she spent in the cell were merely opportunities for her to plot more meticulously. She knew Dazai was suspicious of her, but she saw that as an advantage. For her, it was all just a game, and she intended to make every move with precision and cunning. A few days later, members of the Mafia rushed to Dazai with the shocking news of Shina's escape. Dazai looked up calmly, showing no signs of surprise. One of the Mafia members, visibly shaken, approached him and said nervously, Dazai-san, how did that girl manage to escape from the cell? The whole building was under surveillance. With a sly grin, Dazai replied coolly, Maybe we locked up someone who had been planning her escape all along, and her plan was more thorough than we'd anticipated. Chuya, who had been informed of the situation and was visibly furious, approached Dazai and glared at him. His voice trembling with anger, he said, This is exactly what I warned you about, Dazai. But you let her escape. And now she can hurt the Mafia even more than before. Dazai turned his head toward Chuya with that same unshakable calm and said, What do you think, Chuya? Do you really believe I couldn't have prevented Shina's escape? Or maybe I let her go on purpose? Chuya shouted angrily. What do you mean by that? You did this to prove what, Dazai? She's not just a pawn. She's a real threat to all of us." Dazai chuckled, replying, "Sometimes, to uncover the truth, you have to let the game reach its peak. Shina returned because of her past, and now she has bigger plans. If we want to understand exactly how much of a threat she is to the Mafia, we need to give her room to move. When the enemy feels free, that's when you can find their weaknesses." Chuya glared at Dazai, his anger mixed with doubt, and said with barely contained frustration, "I'm warning you, Dazai. If this plan fails, the consequences will be severe for all of us. If she turns into that merciless person you believe she will, a lot of people, including us, could be her first victims." Dazai nodded calmly, saying, "Then let's see where this game goes, Chuya." After that night, Shina disappeared. Dazai sensed that this calmness was the silence before the storm, and that soon, Shina would begin executing her plans of vengeance. For days on end, Dazai ordered everyone to stay on high alert, monitoring even the slightest changes. During this time, Chuya continued to be wary of Dazai. Though he didn't fully trust Dazai's approach, as his partner, he had no choice but to follow orders. A few weeks passed, and amid the eerie quiet, Dazai discovered clues suggesting that Shina was planning attacks on the Mafia's most strategic locations. A few days later, Shina's first strike came. One of the Mafia's most important weapons warehouses was set ablaze in the dead of night, causing substantial damage to the organization. Dazai and Chuya arrived quickly at the scene. Chuya, barely able to contain his fury, gave Dazai a cold look and said, "Your plan is spiraling out of control. She's turning into a monster, not a pawn." Dazai, not losing an ounce of his composure, responded, "Be patient, Chuya." Days turned into weeks, and recapturing Shina seemed impossible. She had attacked several of the Mafia's hideouts, eliminating a number of high-ranking members. Days passed, and the damage Shina inflicted on the Port Mafia was inevitable. Her ability, the Black Flowers, was arguably one of the most dangerous abilities in the world. Yet, despite all the dangers Shina posed, she was, after all, just a human. A person who longed for her family. On the anniversary of her family's murder, the atmosphere around the cold, quiet house where it all happened held a heavy, eerie stillness. The cold, dry stones beneath Shina's feet reminded her that it was in this very place, years ago, that everything changed for her. Standing there, calm yet with eyes full of rage and revenge, she stared at the walls, the silent witnesses to her scars. The heavy silence of the house was broken by a soft sound. Dazai entered with a calm look and a meaningful smile. He glanced around and then said to Shina, "This is the place where your story began, isn't it? Or maybe it's the climax of this tale of revenge." Without moving from her spot, Shina responded bitterly, "Revenge hasn't ended for me, but maybe for you, it's just an interesting game." Dazai stepped closer and said softly, "Revenge ultimately leaves nothing of you, Shina. Maybe you win today, but how long will you keep yourself imprisoned in this nightmare?" Shina cast a deep, uncertain look at Dazai and replied in a cold tone, "Maybe you're right. Maybe revenge won't bring anything back. But for me, there's nothing else left to believe in." Dazai's faint smile returned, and with a quiet, slightly shaky voice, he said, "Shina, you might think that here, in this moment, revenge is all that gives you meaning. But there's something inside you that's far more than that. Something that has drawn me to you." Shina, surprised and slightly angry, stared at him. "What are you talking about, Dazai? This doesn't sound like the Dazai I know. Can you just be your usual self?" Dazai came even closer, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. He paused for a moment, then confessed sincerely, "I love you, Shina." Shina couldn't believe his words. She never thought someone like Dazai could feel that way about her. But before she could respond or react, Dazai pulled her closer, wrapped his arms around her, and held her in his embrace. Their lips met in the heavy silence, and for a moment, everything was forgotten. But Shina quickly snapped back to reality, separating from him in confusion and shock. Dazai stayed in place as Shina gave him a lingering look before turning and disappearing into the darkness of the night. After that fateful kiss, Shina quietly vanished. No one in the Port Mafia could find her. It was as if she had decided to abandon her path of revenge once and for all. There were no more killings, hidden attacks, or signs of her former hostility. Dazai knew she was still somewhere in Yokohama, but she no longer posed any harm to the Port Mafia. Over the days and nights, Shina moved through the city like a shadow. Glimpses of her were seen in narrow alleys, on rooftops, and sometimes in the dark corners of local cafes. She no longer sought to kill or cause chaos. It seemed she had chosen a new path, though a lingering air of sorrow and mystery still surrounded her. Every now and then, Dazai would quietly visit places where he thought she might appear, but he would only catch fleeting glimpses of her before she vanished like the wind. He was still under her influence, and for the first time in his life, he felt a yearning for something he couldn't easily obtain. Lost in thoughts of past memories, Dazai suddenly heard the door open again. Shina had returned. She slammed her hand down on the desk and shouted angrily, "Fine! I'll join the armed detective agency."